The human brain is an amazing thing. Your conscious mind captures about 50 bits of data every single second. The only problem is, in the same single second, your brain actually receives about 10 million bits of data. So what happens to the rest? Well, it gets processed by our unconscious mind, which makes almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us without us realising it. And to do that, it uses a whole series of shortcuts and rules of thumb based on our background, culture, environment, and personal experience. By way of an example, here's 2 questions for you. See if you can notice how quickly your unconscious brain answers them. Number 1. According to the Bible, how many of each type of animal did Moses take into the ark? Number 2. How many triangles are there in this picture? For this first one, did you answer 2? Well, that's wrong, because Moses didn't take any animals into the ark. It was Noah. And what about this one? Did you answer 2? Or maybe 6? 8? 16? Now stop a moment and remind yourself of the definition of a triangle. A plane shape with 3 straight sides and 3 angles, right? Now how many of the triangles that you think you are looking at have got 3 sides? That's right, none of them. In both of those cases, our unconscious brain has jumped to make a link or to fill in a gap. And it's relying on instinct, an intuitive feeling that if it looks right and feels right, it must be right, so go with it, rather than analysis. In evolutionary terms, this instinctive response has helped us survive. The problem is, especially when it comes to tasks that require a rational rather than a life or death response, our unconscious mind is wrong a lot of the time. And research shows that we are at our most susceptible to unconscious bias when we're under time pressure in an area that we feel we are comfortable or knowledgeable in, such as assessing students. Now, we all like to think we're open-minded and objective, but research consistently shows that much of our decision making is affected by unconscious bias. It affects everyone, regardless of culture, social group, education, age or experience. Now, I know none of this is news to you. You've heard it all before, right? The problem is just knowing it is not enough to overcome unconscious bias. Research shows that there is consistently a direct link between unconscious bias and the actual decisions we make. We are susceptible to it all of the time. Right now, teachers across the country are being asked to make judgments on the skills, abilities and knowledge of individual students in order for them to be awarded an exam grade. And we owe it to each and every one of them to do so as objectively as possible, ensuring that the ultimate conclusions we reach are a fair, balanced and impartial assessment of their abilities, uncoloured by unrelated factors and influences. To do this, we all need to take positive, conscious, active steps to guard against unconscious bias. Before we move on though, let's be clear about one important point. In asking you to take positive action to guard against unconscious bias, we are not suggesting you are unprofessional. We are not suggesting you are unfair or unequal in your treatment of students, and we're not suggesting you are consciously biased. We are simply recognising that we are all human, and hence need to take active and deliberate steps to guard against the dangers of unconscious bias creeping into our assessments. Now, before we think about what steps we can actively take to guard against unconscious bias, let's first quickly identify 5 biases in particular that we should be aware of. Number 1, the halo effect. The halo effect describes the tendency for a positive impression about someone in one area to lead us to draw unduly positive impressions about them in another unrelated area without considering the objective evidence or data. In our assessment of students, this bias could lead us to assess a student more favourably than we should in one area on the basis of good performance or behaviour in a different unrelated area. Number 2, the horns effect. The horns effect is the opposite of the halo effect, describing the tendency for a negative impression about someone in one area to lead us to draw unduly negative impressions about them in another unrelated area, without considering the objective evidence or data. This bias could lead us to assess a student more harshly than we should in one area on the basis of poor performance or behaviour in a different area. Number 3, affinity bias. Also known as similarity bias, Affinity bias describes the tendency to view people more positively if their interests, experiences, views or background are similar to ours. In a school setting, this could lead us to view students who we naturally positively engage or connect with more positively than those we don't. Our judgment might also be affected by the degree to which we feel a student fits our own mental image of what a good student looks like. Number 4, the contrast effect. The contrast effect happens when our perception of something is distorted by comparison to something else. For instance, in an interview, a strong candidate may appear more capable and experienced than they actually are if they are interviewed after a weaker candidate simply because of the contrast between the two. In our case, this could lead us to view a student as more or less capable than they actually are simply because of the students who we have assessed just before them. Number 5, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias describes the tendency to draw conclusions about a situation or person based on your own personal desires, beliefs and prejudices, rather than on unbiased evidence. It's a consequence of failing to guard against all of these biases, plus many others. Confirmation bias tends to unduly focus on and accentuate evidence that supports our conclusions and beliefs, and ignores and downplays evidence that contradict them. We often use confirmation bias to self-justify our unconscious, possibly prejudicial and likely biased judgments. Again, being susceptible to any of these biases doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you a person. It just means you're human. But that doesn't mean we just have to accept them. There are things we can do to eliminate or at least minimise their impact. Specifically, there's 4 things we're asking you to do to ensure that unconscious bias does not influence any of our assessments of our students. Number 1, slow down decision making. We know that we are more susceptible to unconscious bias when we make decisions in haste or under pressure, so make sure you are allocating the time and space to perform robust and thorough assessments. Number 2, identify our cultural, organisational and personal norms, expectations and preferences, and ask to what extent they are relevant or might be colouring our assessment. Number 3, reconsider your reasons for decisions. To ensure objectivity, consistency and fairness for everyone, we need to make sure we keep looping back through the process, re-evaluating and reconsidering our decisions on individual students and the cohort as a whole. Number 4, monitor each other for unconscious biases. Because we're all human, our starting assumption must be that we are susceptible to unconscious bias, and hence we need to support and challenge each other to ensure we are doing all we can to eliminate it and hence ensure a fair process. So that means being willing to be challenged and also happy to challenge those around you. We recognise that this is a unique and challenging time for everybody involved, no more so than the students themselves, who after many years of hard work, commitment and dedication will not now have the opportunity to demonstrate their skills and knowledge in the traditional manner. We owe it to each and every one of them to ensure that our process is as objective as possible, ensuring that the ultimate conclusion is a fair, balanced and impartial assessment of their abilities, uncoloured by unrelated factors and influences. To do that, we all need to consciously, deliberately and actively work together to guard against unconscious biases in our decision making.